Okay, so holiness and glory. First of all, what is holiness not? Because if we think about it, holiness has often been misconstrued in our culture. So here are some things of what holiness is not. One is lack of emotion. Another is being constantly solemn, or just, as the culture thinks, not having any fun. A third is a kind of high-minded judging of other people, more of a looking down your nose at someone. And a last one is hiding our faults to appear holy, while not actually being holy. Think of the Pharisees and their whitewashed tombs. Reference that God made, Christ made specifically. But the thing is, I'm talking about God's holiness. So how do all of these things play into how we view God and his holiness? One thing is, God's not just holy, he's holy, 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 which is the Hebrew way of saying he is the ultimate level of holiness. So, in that, if holiness is not lack of emotions, that means God actually does have emotions, and he does display them. So that means, well, if God did have a lack of emotions, well, we'd all be sunk, because just plain justice says that we should all be condemned eternally because of our sin. Thankfully, holiness does not mean a lack of emotions. And same with solemnity. I mean, if God was utterly solemn and didn't do anything but act solemn, and a lot of people would deem it uptight, well, he wouldn't have rested on the seventh day. God resting on the seventh day was a time he took to relax. So therefore, God's not always solemn. And then judging other people, specifically a high-minded type of judging other people. That is a judging of other people without, a good way of saying it is judging people without having mercy, without having consideration. And here's an interesting thing. First murder in the world, Cain. God had mercy on him. God did not judge him high-mindedly. God judged him. And in the rest of the Old Testament, after the law, if someone murdered someone in Israel, they were stoned or killed in another way. But God didn't do that to Cain. He had mercy and just cursed Cain. Justice was still done, but God did not judge him harshly. He judged him and gave him lenience. And out of Cain came the first workers of metal and brass and musicians. So God did not judge that sin harshly, and in so doing, demonstrated his holiness. So, what is holiness? Technically, the dictionary definition of holiness is the state of being holy, but that doesn't help us out. Holy, in the dictionary definition, is put down as being one of these things, being separate, being sanctified in the religious sense, and then the third, which is the best definition, I believe, is being set apart. So think of it in this way. You know a target. You always, if you're aiming at a target, you always want to get bullseye, right? Well, think of the outer edge as holy. The middle one as being holy, holy. And the bullseye as being holy, holy, holy. As a people, we all miss the target completely. God is the only one who actually is holy, holy, holy. And yet, holy being set apart, it's interesting. There are over 2 trillion galaxies just in the known and observable universe. And yet God chose the Milky Way, one of the smallest, to play out his divine drama. And then out of all the solar systems in the Milky Way galaxy, he chose our solar system to play out the divine drama. And out of the 9 planets, if you include Pluto, he chose Earth to play out the divine drama. And in all of the Earth, places where there were multiple places that were much more lush, more green, more vibrant in the Middle East. That's where God chose to play out the majority of the drama. And he even chose a common man, Abraham, to be the man who was the progenitor, the father of a huge nation and multiple nations. And of all the area in the Middle East, he chose the area of Israel, which, compared to Egypt, is a harsh and barren land. But he chose Israel, the land of Israel, and also he chose Abraham's grandson, Jacob, whose name became Israel. And Jacob was a trickster who became redeemed into a prince. Two names. Jacob meant trickster, Isaac. Israel meant prince of nations. But then, not only was the whole nation of Israel set apart, but one of the tribes, the Levites, were set apart. They were not only part of the holy people of Israel, they were the holy tribe inside Israel. The one whose whole purpose was to provide the facilities to glorify God. And the priests inside that, their whole purpose was to be the actual people who went into the temple and offered sacrifices to God. And the high priest was the one who only one day a year, in the holiest day in Judaism, to go in and offer a sacrifice for the whole of Israel. So the priests were holy, and the high priest was holy. And in the land of Israel, Jerusalem was the holy city. So many references to it as a holy city, the Mount of Zion. But the Temple Mount was a holy place in Jerusalem. But once the temple was built, the temple was a holy place. And inside the temple, here are the two holies. The holy place, and as the King James Version translates it, the Holy of Holies. Most other versions translate it the most holy place. But as the King James Version translates it, it's the Holy of Holies. Just holy and holy of holies. It's not the holy place. That is only where God resides. And here's the thing. One day a year, on the holiest day in Judaism, the high priest, the holy person, goes into the Holy of Holies and offers a sacrifice to the holy God. Because of that, all the sins for Israel were wiped away. And here's an interesting thing about how Israel as a people viewed God's holiness. Every year on that day, the high priest had a rope tied around his ankle. So if he was not fully holy enough when he went in to meet the holy God, and he died because he was not ready, they could pull him out before, as they believed, the whole earth would shatter. That's the image that the Israelites had of their God. Holy to the uttermost. And as I read from the Bible Project, the ultimate of holiness goes to ultimate goodness, ultimate authority, and ultimate power. Basically meaning God has everything. It is central to his nature. His holiness is part of the pivot at the rest of his nature revolves around. And as I said earlier, we all missed the target completely. We're not even holy. Why does that leave us? As that priest who is holy, the most holy of the entire race of humanity. If he was liable to die, what does that mean for the rest of us? But here's the thing. Prophet Ezekiel had a vision. The holiness of God pours out from the temple like a river, revitalizing and purifying all the land it comes into contact with. What did Jesus call the temple? He called his body the temple. And what came out of his side when it was pierced? Water, like a river. Blood and water, like a river. And that is how we are purified and brought into God's holiness. As in 2 Peter 1:4, it says that we are now partakers of the divine nature, which means as holiness is central to God's nature, we are now partakers of God's holiness. Not to the same extent, because we are not that holy, but we are now holy in his sight. Because of that drives us to glorify God. But often we go about it the wrong way. As I noticed earlier with the being constantly solemn in holiness, that not being the case, we often try to do something similar. We abstain from certain things as if that glorified God. And sometimes, for example, abstaining from sin, yes, that does glorify God, because it shows we're not like the rest of the world. But at the same time, when we abstain from things that are not sinful, when we just separate ourselves off, that doesn't glorify God. It makes us look like self-righteous pricks. That's what it does. But the thing is, glorifying God doesn't mean we withdraw from people, withdraw from good things, but actually that we go forward to secure what is best for those around us, secure the best for the others. Unlike what happened in the Garden of Eden, where Eve secured what she thought was best, we need to secure what is best, and that is Christ. Christ to everyone is the best for everyone. But why does God deserve this glory that we want to give him? Well, we just went over that just a few moments ago. God is so holy, he deserves ultimate power, ultimate respect, and he has ultimate authority. So he could force us to give him glory, but he doesn't. That's another reason why we should give him glory. And because he deserves this exaltation, that's part of why he created us. Since he should be glorified, we have been created to glorify him. And when we failed in that, in the garden, well, he's had the people of Israel. He created the people of Israel. Very literally, he created the people of Israel when he allowed Sarah to conceive beyond childbearing age. They were to glorify God through how they lived. Sadly, they did not. And after Christ, it came to those who followed him. And sadly, too often we don't do that well either. But again, we became partakers of the divine nature, which also means we become partakers of glory. We're not going to get that glory in this life because we're called to be humble. And oddly enough, and that prevents us from taking glory because we're not deserving of this honor and respect. The only glory we do get will be in heaven, and the greatest glory we get is when God says to us, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." And immediately as we receive that, the Bible states, we will all cast our crowns back at him, saying, "Only you are the one worthy of this." Because of his holiness and his glory, this shows that, well, when we glorify God, the way we do it best is by witnessing to others and those to Christ. And that, the holiness of God compels us to glorify him. And to glorify him, we are compelled, as Jesus Christ told us to, in the Great Commission, to go out and teach the world of Christ.
Mic drop. Back away from the chair. Thanks, Matthew. Lots of good information to think about there. Any comments, questions, or follow-ups to what you heard that you want to engage with Matthew on, or just throw out for the rest of us?
I just want to say that, Matt, good job. And you look like you're gonna do great in your studies, in Bible studies, in your continued Bible studies. You can tell it's something you're passionate about.
This is my favorite topic.
I can tell.
He does have a keen mind. So to that, I had one thought I wanted to ask about. When you gave the dictionary definitions of holiness, you gave 3: separate, sanctified, and set apart.
Yeah.
And this kind of tees up what we'll talk about on holiness later. But for Matthew or anyone, does set apart require separate? You're shaking your head no. Why?
Okay, so set apart does not require being separate, because one, we're called to be in this world, but not of this world. That's basically God saying, yes, I am setting you apart. You are something different, but you're not in a different place. As we've been going over in Bible study methods, just this Tuesday and today, we're ambassadors. We're citizens of a coming kingdom, or a kingdom that is coming here. But we're still here. We're citizens of a different place. And showing that we are those different citizens, by how we live.
So holiness is more of, or being separate, set apart, is more a function of nature, character, lifestyle, than it is necessarily of spatial distance. And it's interesting you brought up the piece about in the world but not of the world, because that's right in the heart of the prayer where Jesus is praying that his people would be sanctified. Don't take them out of the world, but sanctify them in the world, set them apart within the world by your truth. Make them be a different kind of people, bearing a different kind of fruit. And so that's true of us as God's people. Is that true of God himself? Matthew talked at some length about sort of the concentric zones of holiness, Jerusalem, for example, being in the Jewish mind, the center of the world, and in Jerusalem is the temple, and in the temple is the holy place, and in the holy place is the Holy of Holies, and in the Holy of Holies is the holy, holy, holy God, right? And so he's, in a sense, he's contained and sectioned off in a sacred space, so that we don't necessarily, or Israel wouldn't necessarily just encounter Yahweh on the street, like, say, Abraham did when the 3 visitors came, to see him. So there's a sense in which, in the biblical story, there's a separation that corresponds with God being set apart. So, and we've already seen that's not necessarily the case with people who are sanctified. Is it necessarily the case with God? That set apart implies separation.
I don't think that even applies completely with God, because in multiple places he communes with people who are not holy. For instance, Moses was not holy when he was at the burning bush. He became holy as he spent time with God, as God purified, but he was not holy at that first point. Also, when Jesus communed with Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus was not holy, but in that short time he was with Christ, he became holy. He became purified.
Yeah.
God is out to people to purify them and to make them holy, and that requires he not to be completely separate.
That's a great commercial for part 2, which, go ahead, Tim, if you want to make a comment, then we'll take a break and we'll come back and unpack some more of that.
I was just going to say that it also says in the Bible that our bodies are a temple for God, right?
Yeah.
So if we're the temple, where does that mean God's dwelling? He's dwelling in us. So can't really be completely separate that way.
Right. But that's on the assumption, though, that, and this isn't in the plans to talk about, so I'll just make a quick comment, that we are somehow profane or unclean. And the like Paul, who talks about God indwelling us, also, he doesn't describe us as an unholy temple. He describes us as a holy temple in which God dwells by his Spirit, because by the work of Christ that Matt talked about a minute ago, we have been cleansed. We have been sanctified as a people. So, and there is that residual impurity, right? We're still in this already, but not yet. But I think the reason why Paul can say things like that, and Peter too, that the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, is dwelling in us, is because they view us as the holy people. Same reason why Yahweh could dwell among the Israelites, because they were his special, unique, holy people. And this also brings up the question that I want to come back to after we take a little break. And Matt touched on it a little bit, but I think we slide back into often and easily the notion that holiness is a moral category. Like, how could the Holy Spirit dwell in us because we're sinful? And it certainly has a moral facet to it. And the prophets especially pick that up. that, the righteousness of Israel is actually unrighteousness, and therefore there's a problem when they try to continually live in the presence of a holy God. The Levitical system, as Matt pointed out, was the means by which they could maintain their holiness, so that they could have fellowship with God. But because they basically didn't use that in conjunction with the fear of the Lord and a humble heart, and then they weren't really truly pure, regardless of what was external. So there is a moral piece, but holiness is actually bigger than a moral category. And if you read the laws, if you slog through Leviticus, you'll see a lot of moral laws in there. That's where the greatest, second greatest commandment, love your neighbor as yourself, is. In fact, Reeves referred to that in the book, right? Leviticus 19. But that's sprinkled in the midst of a whole bunch of ritual purity laws. And sometimes they're like stacked together right next to each other. So I don't think that Israel had this categorization that we sort of have between a ritual law and a moral law. I think that developed over time, and I think it especially developed on the other side of Christ's fulfillment of the law, because it made sense how some of those ritual things became fulfilled and no longer necessary. And yet the moral claims upon the people were still there. Like, God still expected them to love God and love their neighbor, and all the moral stuff that comes with that. And I think because of that, like, this notion of holiness has sort of morphed into being defined by most people inside and outside the church as sort of a moral purity. And that's sort of what Matt was getting at when he talked about that, like a high-minded judgmentalism, like a holier than thou attitude. But fundamentally, in the Bible, as he said, it's about separation. Well, it's about set apartness, maybe with or without separation. It's about distinction. And one of the ways God is distinct from fallen humanity is morally, right? And that's one of the problems we have when we try to enter the sacred space, and why there's a legitimate concern about the high priest, right, going into God's presence, or about the guy touching the ark, the holy ark that is about to fall off the cart, or about the priests who offer the strange fire. Like that's serious business. But it's not like holiness in and of itself isn't strictly moral. That's just one aspect of a more fundamental concept. And so the reason why I think God had to be separate, and why Israel had to go through or had to be given moral and ritual cleanliness, was because I just kind of lost my train of thought here. Well, it's because it was life after Genesis 3, right? Moses' shoes were dirty. And Moses' life was dirty. So there's, even people today in Asia take off their shoes when they go in a temple. It's not because their shoes are sinful. It's just because holiness is such that it requires a degree of respect and honor, and you don't tread with dirty feet in there. You also don't tread with a dirty life. Psalm 24 and 15, who may ascend to the Lord in his holiness? Well, the pure in heart, basically, is what the Psalms say. So it's both and, but I think we tend to reduce it to a moral category. And the separation piece, it's true, God has to kind of cordon himself off and create some boundaries for the people and some ways of purification and levels of purification, so that even a representative can go in and encounter him. But it was not that way from the beginning. And I think that's telling. And it's not going to be that way at the end. In John's vision of a new heaven and earth, the dwelling of God is with man, and the Holy One is there, and all of God's people are the priesthood with his name on their forehead, entering into his presence and seeing him face to face. So that doesn't mean he's any less holy or set apart, but it means the separation will be done away with, because the separation wasn't the original intent. Okay, let's come back at about 11:33, and we'll pick up a couple more thoughts on holiness. I'll try not to spend the whole rest of the time on holiness, because I want to leave a little bit of time for glory and continue to do a little reframing. If you have any questions that you want to address, speak them during the break or type them in the chat, and I'll look at them before we start, or ask as soon as we get back on. Capiche? Cool? All right, see you in a few.